from Kimmy?
Minnesota.
That's right. So welcome, Kimmy. We are so thrilled to have you here. And Kimmy is a wealth of knowledge. I call her the queen of the quilting universe. Does that sound pretty good, Kimmy?
Oh, I like that title. Do you think that if I tell my children that's my title, that they'll clean up the bathroom for me?
That chance. Try it. It might work. It might work.
Maybe not.
Well, go ahead. We are so excited to get started here. There's Kimmy with us, and you will be able to see us, but you'll just see Kimmy's still shot because we couldn't work out any video for that. She's got lots of information. So Kimmy, introduce yourself if there's anything you want to tell, and just get going. You have control of the PowerPoint, so we'll just get going.
Thank you very much, Vicki and Marie. Good morning, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about what you can do to make sure that your quilts turn out straight when you take them off your quilting machine. You have questions as we go along. Go ahead and ask them. And if you're asking about something that I will be covering later in the webinar, then I'll just let you know. We're going to cover that later on. So don't think that I'm ignoring you. Just wait until that subject comes up in the webinar. But here we go, and remember, if you've got questions, ask them as we go along. One of the most frustrating things that especially new quilters run into is they get their quilting machine and they put their first quilt on the machine and they quilt it and they think it's going to turn out great, and they take it off the machine and it's not straight and they don't understand why. And basically, no matter what type of quilting that you're doing, whether it's all over work or custom work, we all want our quilts to be flat in the end. We want sides that are straight. We want corners that are square and not dog ears. We want sashing strips that line up well and straight throughout our quilt and provide a nice framework for our blocks. And we want blocks that are not puckery and distorted and puffy when they should be flat. We want a quilt that when we lay it on the bed, it will be nice and flat and draped nicely on the corners. We want a quilt that will hang flat on the wall and not wave at us every time that we walk past. None of those things are going to happen if you don't pay attention to 3 simple unbreakable rules when you're quilting. And those rules are, you have to make sure that you're working with straight leaders, because if your leaders aren't straight, your quilt's not going to be straight. It's as simple as that. You have to make sure that your backing is on grain, and you have to make sure that you've loaded your quilt correctly. All 3 of those things are really simple. They require very little extra time during the quilting process, but they have a huge impact on how your quilt is going to turn out. Today I'm going to walk you through the steps. I'll show you how simple they are, and in the end you're going to know how easy it is to achieve a much more professional finish on your quilts. Step number 1 is to straighten your leaders. Most quilters that I talk to have no idea how crucial it is that their leaders are straight on their machine, and they don't realize what a huge impact those straight or not straight leaders will have on their finished quilts. As it says on your screen, it's a really easy task, and if you do it yourself, you're looking at maybe an hour or 2. If you ask your husband to help you, it's going to take you all afternoon, and you're probably going to get in a fight. So just do it yourself, because it takes no time at all. I will tell you step by step how to do it, and I'll show you a bunch of pictures so that you will see how to do it. But before we get started on that, I want to explain to you how it is that your leaders got stretched in the first place, because once you understand how that happened, you'll understand how to avoid having it happen in the future. If you look at the leaders on your machine, every time that you pin a quilt onto your leaders and you tighten those leaders up, you are applying tension to the center portion of that leader. If you've just got a little baby quilt or a wall hanging pinned on, you might only be taking up maybe 40-45 inches of space on the middle of your leader. If you have a queen size quilt, you're taking up maybe 90 inches of space on your leader. But the point is, there's always something in the middle of the leader, and there's rarely something pinned on to the very ends of our leaders, because usually we don't use the full length of our leaders. Every time you tighten up those rollers, you're putting tension on those leaders, and because the leaders are made of fabric, they stretch a little bit more with every tighten, a little bit more, and over time, you're going to cause a great amount of distortion on your leaders. Now, if you think about a leader that's had a couple of years worth of quilts pinned to it, you maybe started out with a nice straight piece of canvas, but over time that straight edge has distorted into a long and gentle U with the belly of the U, or the bottom of the curve of the U, right in the middle of the leader. And if you stand in front of your machine, the front where the handlebars are, and you look at your machine, you're going to see that your take-up leader looks like a right side up U, and your top leaders and backing leaders look like upside down U's. So if you pin your quilt to those stretched, distorted leaders, once you take your quilt off, the top of your quilt is going to look like it's smiling at you, and the bottom of your quilt is going to look like it's frowning at you. Maybe it's only a little bit of a smile and a little bit of a frown, or maybe it's quite a bit of a smile and quite a bit of a frown, but either way, your straight edges are not going to be straight. The remedy for that problem is simple. You just need to straighten your leaders out. And here's how to do it. You want to pin your take-up leader and your top leader to one another, making sure that both of them are coming straight off the rollers. You don't want to have them coming out to the side. You want them coming straight off. So you pin them together, just as I have in this picture. And when you're doing this, you're going to see right away if your leaders have warped, because the center area of your pinned together leaders will be loose and floppy, while the ends will be taut. Let's go back to that previous picture and I'll show you what I mean. If you look at this middle section of the leaders, you'll see how that is bowed and floppy. That's because that's the middle of my leader. That's where the greatest area of stretch was. If you look down here at the end, you'll see that my leaders are still tight here, and they're tight down here. They flop in the middle. And just be aware that if you have never straightened your leaders, you might be surprised at how much distortion you've gotten over the years. Now your leaders are pinned together. You want to position them so that those pinned together edges are right in the center of your work area, just like you're working on a quilt. You don't want to have to reach really far to do this. You want them right in the middle where you can easily reach. You bring your machine head over, and you position it so that your needle is far enough above this previously stitched hem so that it's going to be out of the way when you're stitching a new hem. I'll show you a picture in a few minutes that's going to make a lot more sense for that. You want to set your horizontal channel lock, and you want to stitch a nice straight line, just like this line right in here. You are stitching that straight line to create a guideline for you to fold back and create a new hem. And again, that'll make more sense in a few minutes when I show you a picture. So you'll stitch that straight line on your take-up leader and your top leader, and then you're going to unpin your top leader from the take-up leader and pin your bottom leader to the take-up leader, and you will stitch that same straight line on your bottom leader or your backing leader, this nice straight line, just like you did with the other two leaders. And after that, you can unpin the leaders because that part is finished. Next, you want to get your ironing board and a nice hot steam iron, and you want to set them both up right next to your machine so that you can press new hemmed edges onto your leaders. You want a steam iron that gets really, really hot because you're pressing canvas and you want a nice, crisply pressed edge. This edge is going to set you up for a nice straight edge, so you want to make sure that it's nice and crisp. If you have Velcro leaders, you're in luck because you can just zip them right off the machine and take them over to your ironing board and press them there. So we'll start by laying our top leader on the ironing board, and we'll fold that leader back right along that straight line that you just stitched. That's your guideline for your new pressed edge. You want to press firmly, and you want to allow that leader to cool and set before you move it because you want that edge to stay nice and crisp. You're going to do that same thing for your top leader and for your backing leader. And hang on just a second. There we go. Here's a picture of my little ironing board set up right in front of my machine. You can see I've got my iron sitting on a little ironing board. I've got a pressing pad sitting on a little portable table. And you can see my leader is draped right up and over that little pressing pad, so I can get a nice crisp edge without having to stretch my leader way out. We're going to do the same thing for our take-up leader. Now, our take-up leader obviously isn't going to reach to the front of our machine, so we're going to have to haul the whole setup to the back of the machine, which is not a big deal. I'll show you a picture in a minute. You are going to be... Yes, ma'am.
Sorry to break in. I've got a question that I want to have you address while you're talking about this. We have a few questions on what about people that have the red snappers?
If you've got red snappers, you want to make sure that you are creating a hem, and we'll address this in just a moment. You want to make sure that you're creating a new hem that's big enough to slide your snappers or your leader grip into that hem. I use leader grips when I'm loading my backing. I don't use leader grips on my top because they don't allow me to ease in fullness, but I do put leader grips on my backing. And I want to make sure that the hem that I'm creating is big enough to slip my leader grip rod into. Does that answer the question?
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
All right, let me advance. Here's my take-up leader on the back of my machine, and as you can see, I just laid my pressing pad down on my machine table, and I want that pressing pad to be thick enough so that the heat of my iron cannot possibly penetrate all the way through to my tabletop. You don't want to distort your tabletop. So what I did to create this pressing pad was to take the empty cardboard from a bolt of fabric, and I wrapped a couple of towels around it and an old wool blanket. And then I wrapped a dishcloth, a white dishcloth around the outside of that and safety pinned it into place. So I have a nice sturdy little pressing pad that the heat will not travel through. So I don't have to worry about wrecking my tabletop. And I'm just going to slide that pressing pad right down the table as I go, pressing a crisp new edge on my hem. Once you've pressed new edges on all three of your leaders, it's time to stitch them, and you're going to stitch those right on the machine just like you did when you were stitching your nice straight guideline. You want to clamp the ends of your leader tightly to hold it in place. You don't want it flopping all over the place. You're going to set your channel lock and stitch that new hem approximately 1 inch away from your pressed edge. And let me show you a picture. Here is my clamp holding the end of my leader. Here's my old hem. Here's my new pressed edge. And as you can see, if you look at the screen of my machine, I've got my horizontal channel lock engaged, and I'm stitching a straight line right along here, about 1 inch away from my new pressed edge. That's going to give me plenty of room. Yes, ma'am.
What if a customer doesn't have a horizontal channel lock? How would you suggest they do this?
There are a couple different ways. If you've got a Handi Quilter machine, Handi Quilter sells little locks that you just pop right over your wheels that immobilize your wheels so that you can only stitch from side to side. If you have a different type of machine, you can check with your dealer to find out if there are channel locks available, or the easiest way to do that is to go to Staples or Office Max and get those big bulldog clamps. You know what I mean by a bulldog clamp? It's kind of shaped like a triangle with 2 silver wings that come off of it.
Yeah.
If you get a big enough bulldog clamp, you have to look at your table configuration to see how big your bulldog clamp needs to be. You can just put a little clamp right along the portion of your carriage where your wheels roll. Let me explain this so it's more clear.
In order to create the machine, not to the carriage.
No, you attach it to the carriage. If you don't have the clamps like Handi Quilter sells, you have to put a clamp on the carriage. Basically, to create a horizontal or vertical channel lock, all you have to do is immobilize the wheels that allow your machine to roll back and forth or from front to back. If you immobilize one of those wheels, for example, if you put a clamp on the table and you immobilize one of your machine's wheels so that it can't roll from side to side, now you've got a vertical channel lock because all your machine can roll from front to back. If you put a clamp next to one of the machines next to one of the wheels that roll from front to back, now you've got a horizontal channel lock because all your machine can do is roll side to side. Does that make sense?
That sounds good to me. That worked. Thank you, Kimmy.
You bet. All you have to do is immobilize one of the wheels and you've got your channel lock. So just put a clamp on there, make sure that one wheel can't roll, and if one wheel can't roll, none of them can roll. So just immobilize one. Okay, so we've got the clamp, we've got the horizontal channel lock, and I'm stitching a perfectly straight line 1 inch in from the edge all the way down the length of my leader, and I'm creating a new hem. I'm going to stitch new hems on all 3 leaders, and then I'm going to trim away the old hem. Here's my new pressed edge right here. Here's my old hem that I'm cutting away, and here's that straight line that I just stitched with my horizontal channel lock. And remember a few minutes ago when I said that you would want to position your needle so that it's far enough away from the old hem so that the old hem doesn't get in the way of your new hem? This is what I meant. When you're stitching this straight line, you don't want to be stitching it on top of your old hem. You want to position that stitching line far enough away that you can cut away your entire old hem and not have it. You don't want 6 layers of fabric right in here because now you've got to pin through all those layers. So you want that old hem to be completely out of the way. Okay, next thing we have to do is mark our centers. And this is really important. When I got my first machine way back in the late 1990s, it took forever to figure out why each and every one of the quilts that I did came off of my machine with a diagonal pull on the back of the quilt. I could not figure out for the life of me why I was getting these long diagonal lines on the back. It took me forever to figure out that the leaders, which had come pre-marked for me from the factory, were actually off. The center marking on my backing leader was about 2 inches to the left of where the center marking on my take-up leader was. So every quilt backing that I pinned onto my machine was pinned on at a slight diagonal, which meant that as I worked through the quilt and quilted my way through, I was quilting in a diagonal pull, and I was getting puckers on the back, and my quilts never laid flat, and it wasn't until I got my centers lined up that all of a sudden everything was flat. So even if you decide that you don't want to straighten your leaders, you're going to want to do a quick check just to make sure that your centers are lined up so that you aren't dealing with that same frustrating pulling on the back of your quilts. And that will make more sense in just a couple minutes. You start by unrolling your take-up leader, once again making sure that it's coming straight off of its roller. You want that center to actually be laying in the center. You measure the leader and place a mark right there, right in the exact center of the leader using a fine tip permanent marker. Of your 3 leaders, this is the only one that has to be measured. The other 2 you're not measuring, you are just lining them up with your take-up leader. So measure your take-up leader, mark the center, and then you unroll your top leader so that you can butt it snugly up against the take-up leader. You're not pinning them together this time, you're just butting them up right next to one another on the table. Again, making sure that both the leaders are coming straight off their rollers. And you want to make a mark on the top leader that lines up exactly with the center mark on your take-up leader. Here's your take-up leader. Here's your top leader. Here are the center markings. You want them to be stacked one on top of the other. Now this mark on your top leader may or may not actually be in the center of your top leader, but that doesn't matter. It only matters that it is lined up with the center mark on your take-up leader so that when you pin your quilt onto the machine, the top is stacked up right on top of the bottom. You're going to do the same thing to that backing roller. As with the top roller, it doesn't matter a bit if the center marking that you're placing on that backing roller is in the center of the leader or not. It only matters that that center mark lines up with the take-up leader's center mark. By making sure that all 3 of your center markings are lined up perfectly, you can make sure that all 3 layers of your quilt are stacked right on top of each other, your centers are right on top of your centers, and nothing's going to pull or shift or drift out of place as you work your way through the quilt. If you have Velcro leaders, they're pretty awesome. Handi Quilter machines, almost all, I believe almost all, have the Velcro leaders, and I think they're fantastic because if you have a messy problem with your tension on the back, you don't have to stand at your machine and rip stitches out. You can just zip those leaders off and go sit down in a comfy chair and do your work. However, it's really important if you want to do that, that you have some registration marks in place so that when you bring your leaders back to the machine and you want to put them back on the rollers, you want to make sure you're putting them on in exactly the same place that they were when you took them off. And I'll show you what I mean by that. You're going to need a bubble level, and I prefer to use a 12-inch or longer level because I want a nice accurate marking. Little bubble levels don't give you such accurate marks. You want a nice long one like this. And you wobble it back and forth until this little bubble is lined up right in the center of those two markings here and here. You're going to grab your fine tip Velcro, or I'm sorry, your fine tip permanent Sharpie marker. You're going to need a carpenter's chalk line, and I'll tell you in just a moment exactly what a chalk line is. And you're going to need an the roller and let it go quickly. Just really let it go fast, and it snaps a straight line of chalk which extends all the way down the length of the roller, giving you a perfectly straight line right at the very topmost point of your roller. You're going to want to be careful when you're using that chalk line because the chalk is permanent, and if it gets on your leaders or your clothes or your carpet, it's going to make a mess. And that's why you only want to lift it up an inch or so, because if you lift it way up and let it go, you're going to have chalk flying all over your studio and you are not going to be very happy. You're going to repeat that for all three of your rollers so that you have perfectly straight lines that will give you guidelines when you're putting your Velcro on your roller bars. Next, if you do not have adhesive Velcro already, or I'm sorry, if you do not already have Velcro on your rollers and you want to put new Velcro on, you just go out and get some adhesive backed rollers, or I'm sorry, some adhesive backed Velcro. You can usually find that at Joann's or Hancock's or your local sewing Notion store. You're going to put the bristly half of the Velcro on your roller and the soft half of the Velcro on your leader, and you'll repeat that for all your rollers and all your leaders. Then you're going to wipe away that chalk residue from your rollers because you don't want to get that on any of your quilts. And then you're going to do one more thing, and I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that we do sell replacement Velcro for their poles if they want to purchase that from us. So it's an easy thing to purchase. You just order it on our website so they can find that.
Perfect. And that'll be exactly the thing that you need for your machine. You won't have to do any guessing when you're at the store. It's exactly what you need. One more thing and then you're done.
Oh, sorry. You shouldn't need to buy the loop side of the Velcro because that's already on the leader. You just need to buy the new Velcro to put on your poles.
So the new soft or the new bristly side of Velcro, basically. Okay. The last thing that you're going to want to do, and then you're done with your leaders, is you want to create some registration marks so that when you put your Velcro or your Velcro leaders back on the machine, as I said earlier, you want to be lining them up right where they were before, because if you put them back on incorrectly, you're just going to end up with wonky centers again. So I just take my felt tip marker and I just use a extra fine tip Sharpie. I put a little tiny registration mark on the roller and a little tiny registration mark on the leader. And now when I come back to the machine with my leaders, all I have to do is line up my registration marks, and I know that my leaders are going on exactly in the same position as they were when I took them off, which means that my centers are going to be lined up, everything's going to be straight, and my quilts are going to go on just fine. Does that make sense? Okay. Whoops, let me advance. Number two, the next thing that you have to think about is your backing. You want to think about your quilt as if it were a house. Your quilt has all these little pieces that you cut out, and some of them you were careful when you were cutting and they're nice and straight and on grain. Others, maybe you weren't so careful when you were cutting and there's bias where there shouldn't be bias, or maybe you got a little carried away with your steam iron and things got a little warped out of shape. Your quilt top really can't hold itself straight with all those pieces. It needs some help, and the backing is what's going to provide that help. So if you think of your quilt as if it were a house, the backing is the foundation of your house. And if you have a crooked foundation, your house is going to be pretty darn crooked. Your door frames are not going to be straight. Your counters are all going to be crooked. You set a can of soup down on your counter and it's going to roll right off and land on the dog. You want your house to be straight, and you want your quilt to be straight too. So make sure that your backing is a good foundation, because we are relying on that backing fabric to provide stability to everything that is stitched into place on top of it. The batting is not stable enough to hold your quilt straight, and the quilt top is not stable enough to hold itself straight, and your backing can't do the job unless we make sure that it is straight in the first place. We all know what happens when we're trying to piece a quilt top using fabrics that have not been cut on the straight of grain. Our blocks don't want to lay flat. We have to use a lot of steam and a lot of starch to get everything to lay flat. Now imagine that same little piece of fabric as a great big queen size quilt backing. If it is not cut straight in the first place, it's going to ripple and wave all over the place, and your whole quilt is never ever going to lay flat. Plus, you are going to be much more likely to get puckers on the back of your quilt. And it's going to be difficult for you to see the puckers that are waiting to be stitched into place on the back of your quilt because you are busy working on the front of your quilt. So you're not going to know that you've just stitched a pucker until the quilt comes off the machine, and then it's too late and you're going to have to rip it out. So here's what you want to do. It might seem really daunting to think about how am I going to manhandle this great big huge piece of fabric and make sure that it's on grain, but it's really no different than squaring up a fat quarter. It's just a little bit bigger, and you just need an extra set of hands. If you use the frame of your quilting machine, you'll get that extra set of hands that you need, and I'll show you pictures in just a moment. You're going to start by deciding which ends of the backing you're going to pin to your canvas leaders, and those ends become your top and bottom. So you start by folding the quilt lengthwise so that the fold extends from the top end to the bottom end. You're going to drape your fabric over the belly bar of your frame so that the raw edges of the backing are laying up on the rollers and the folded edge is hanging down toward the floor, just like this. Here's the top end of my backing fabric, bottom end. Here's my folded edge, and my raw edges, the side of my quilt backing, are hanging up here over the rollers. As you can see, when you look at this backing, I've got these big diagonal pulls running across my backing fabric because this backing is not squared up. I have nice straight edges, but they're not square edges. If I were to go ahead and pin this backing fabric on and quilt it as is, I'm going to end up with a quilt that's got puckers and creases all over the back of my quilt, and I'm not going to be happy about that at all. So what I want to do before I load is take the top edge, or the top half of my fabric, and slide it over to the left to pull these diagonal pulls out of the way and shift my fabric into its straight and on grain position. And this is what happens. See, those pulls are gone. I now have nice straight fabric that is on grain, ready to cut and ready to pin onto my quilt pin onto my machine and ready to quilt. So what I will do next is take this folded edge, bring it up to the raw edges, fold it a couple of times until it's a width that I can handle. I'm going to carry it all over to my cutting table, and I'm going to use my rotary cutting tools to cut a nice straight edge on this end and a nice straight edge on this end, just as I would if I were squaring up fabric before piecing. And then when I bring it back to my machine, I've got perfectly straight edges to pin and a perfectly straight on grain backing that will help me to eliminate puckers and tucks on the back. Any questions on that one, Vicki? Nope. All right. Next, it comes to. I'm sorry.
There is a question. What do you do when the backing is pieced or has a seam?
The first thing that I want to think about when I have a seam, let me go back a couple of slides. If I have a seam, let's say I've got a seam running right down here, I prefer that seam is, I prefer to pin the backing on so that seam is parallel to my leaders. I don't want that seam running this way, it's perpendicular to the leaders. The reason that I don't want that is because my seam is going to be much tighter than the fabric on either side of the seam. And what's going to happen as I move through the quilt is that tight seam that runs up the middle is going to cause almost like hammocking of the fabric on either side of the seam. Does that make sense? And I don't want that to happen. I want equal tension across the entire back of my seam. So when possible, I will make sure that I load that seam so it's running horizontally. Now sometimes there's just no way around it. Maybe the backing is directional and you have to pin it on so that the seam runs this way instead. When that is the case, with each new advance of your quilt, you want to reach underneath your rollers to the back of your quilt. You want to get your hands right on that seam. You want to pinch it and gently tug it away from the backing leader and toward the take-up leader, just to help reduce that tension a little bit so it's not quite as tight. You don't want to yank it too hard because then you're going to pop the stitches, but just yank it a little bit to release some of that tension. Another thing that can help is before you load that quilt onto the machine, make sure that whoever pieced that backing, whether it was you or your customer, you want to make sure that the selvage edges were not pieced into that seam, because now it's going to be even tighter than it was before. And you can go in and make little tiny snips with a very small set of scissors, little tiny snips to release the selvage, release the tightness of the weave of the selvage. Almost, basically it's the same principle as if you were trying to ease in a sleeve. If you were setting in a sleeve to the armhole, you were constructing a garment, and you want to set in your sleeve, you need to release really tight curves. This is kind of the same thing. And hopefully that answers your question. I know that was a really garbled explanation, but I hope you got it. Okay, next thing is loading your quilt correctly. People often ask, do I have to worry about loading my quilt? Can't I just slap it on there and just start quilting away? And yeah, of course you can. It only matters if you want your quilt to be straight when it comes off the machine, and most of us do want our quilts to be straight when they come off the machine. And if you decide to throw caution to the winds and just slap it on there, you kind of give up the right to act surprised if your quilt comes off the machine looking a little bit crooked. When you're loading a quilt, excuse me, I've got some little tricks that will make things a lot easier. Remember that your main goal is to get the quilt loaded on the machine as straight and as square as possible. The straighter it goes on the machine, the straighter it comes off the machine. The two most popular methods are a full float and a partial float, and I prefer the partial float. But before I tell you how to do that, I'll explain what a full float is so that you'll know what I'm talking about. A full float is you load your quilt backing on, you pin the top and bottom of your quilt backing. You lay your batting on top of the quilt backing, and you lay your top on top of the batting. But you don't pin your top on, you just lay it in place and try to keep it square as you work through the quilt. Some people have good results with that. I find that I have better results when I use a partial float. What a partial float is you pin the bottom of your quilt top onto the top leader, roll it up out of the way, and then baste the top of your quilt top into place on your pinned on backing and batting. And I'll show you step-by-step photos of exactly how you do that. The reason that I like the partial float is because it gives you a little bit of extra control as you're working through your quilt. It's almost like having another set of hands. So if you've got a quilt top that has a lot of issues and there's a lot of fullness, and you want something to hold the quilt in place while you're trying to deal with that fullness, a partial quilt is going to do that for you. I'm sorry, a partial float is going to do that for you. And this is how you do it. You begin by measuring your quilt top in several places to find its actual dimensions. Not the dimensions that the pattern told you it should be, but the dimensions that it is. And that part's really important because the designer of our quilt pattern may have pressed with steam and you press without steam. She may have stitched with a more generous seam allowance or a less generous seam allowance than you used. All of those things are going to combine together to make her measurement different than your measurement. So pay no attention to what the pattern says your quilt width should be. You want to measure to find out what your quilt width actually is. You want to measure in a couple different places and find the true dimensions. Now, what you need to remember is the smallest measurement you get is the measurement you're going to have to go with. So this quilt is 30.5 inches wide. There may be perhaps an area on the top of the quilt where it's 31 inches wide or 32 inches wide, but remember, you can't stretch fabric out to be bigger than it actually is because fabric has memory, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. So if you have varying dimensions, you have to ease in the bigger areas to the smaller areas because you can't stretch the small areas to match the bigger areas. Does that make sense, Vicki? Did I say that right?
Yes.
Okay. Divide the width of your quilt in half and measure out that distance to the left of your leader's center and mark with a pin. Half of 30.5 inches is 15.25 inches. So from my center pin, and I put a pin in there so you could see it more clearly than just you would be able to see the mark. Measure out 15.25 inches to the left and put in a pin. Next, measure out 15.25 inches to the right of center and put another pin. So you now have two pins that have been placed 30.5 inches apart, and those two pins will show you where to pin your corners onto your top leader. The pin in the middle, or the mark in the middle, shows you where the middle of your quilt border goes. Next step is to pin the bottom of your quilt top to its leader, matching the center of the quilt with the center mark, the left corner with the pin to the left of center, and the right corner matches up with the pin to the right of the center. If you have any fullness in your border, you don't want to try and brush it all down to one end and try and jam it all in the last 2 inches. You want to ease in the fullness from the left corner to the center and from the center to the right corner. So you're keeping the fullness where it belongs and you're easing it in gradually as you go instead of trying to ease a whole bunch of fabric in one small portion of your quilt. You're going to roll up the top to get it out of the way, and as you roll, you're going to want to smooth any wrinkles and above all, make sure that you keep it at its proper width. If you pinned it on at 30.5 inches and you want it to come off the machine 30.5 inches, you roll it up and you make sure that it stays 30.5 inches as it goes. So smooth away any wrinkles, keep these edges stacked right on top of one another on the left side and on the right side. Keep your sashing strips nice and straight as you go so that they will quilt nice and straight. And next, you're going to pin on your squared up backing, starting with its bottom edge. Here's all my pins right along my leader edge. And I'm going to roll the backing onto its roller, smoothing it as I go, and then I'll pin the top edge into place. And remember we talked a few minutes ago about not stretching your fabric? That is applicable to both the quilt top and the quilt backing. Fabric has memory and it always goes back to where it was when you started out. So if you have a quilt backing that is 35 inches wide, but you stretch it a little bit as you're pinning on, so now it's 37 inches when you've pinned on because you stretched it too much, these rollers and the tension being applied to those rollers will hold it at 37 inches as you work through the quilt. But what will happen is the minute that you unpin from the rollers and release that tension, that 37-inch wide fabric is going to go right back to 35 inches, and it's going to take everything that is stitched to it with it as it goes along. So you're going to end up with a quilt that will roll to the back. And this also applies as you are working through the quilt. You want to make sure that you have the same tension applied to your backing fabric as you have applied to your top fabric. If you over tighten your back so that you have more tension on the back than you do on the top, when you release that quilt from the leaders, the backing fabric will suck back up and pull the batting and quilt top with it, so you'll end up with a quilt that curls around to the back. If your top is tighter than your backing, when you release it from the machine, it will relax back to where it started and it will curl the backing up and around so that your quilt will kind of look like a great big bowl with curled up edges. So you want to make sure that you never stretch your fabric, because if you do, it's always just going to go right back to where it was before you started stretching. So pin it carefully, do not stretch. You're going to lay your batting on top of your backing, being careful not to stretch it out as you go because you don't want any thin spots. If you pull that batting from a package and it's really creased, you can just toss it in the dryer for maybe 5 to 10 minutes on low heat. It'll fluff right up and those wrinkles will fall out. I use my dryer all the time to get rid of wrinkles. I fluff it up, heat it up, and then I toss my batting over my machine to cool off and relax, and the wrinkles are gone in no time flat. So now you've got your batting laying on top of your backing fabric. It's all smoothed into place. It's centered on the backing. You want to use your channel lock and stitch a straight line across the top, which bastes together your backing and your batting. And that straight basting line is going to provide a guideline for pinning your quilt top into place, and that's going to help you get a perfectly straight top on your quilt. I'll show you a picture of what I mean. Here, right on the other side of this tape measure is that straight basting line. You can kind of see it peeking out right over here. All the way across the quilt top. I drop that basting line down about 2 or 3 inches from my pinned on edges, because that way if I want to use any rulers on my quilt border as I'm quilting, my pins aren't going to get in the way of my quilt rulers. So I want to keep that line a couple inches away so that I'm not stabbing myself to death with pins as I work through my top border. So I'm going to put a pin in the center of that basted line, and it's easy to find the center because right up here is the little center mark on my quilt's take-up leader, right there. Drop a pin in the center. Once again, measure out 15¼ inches. There's a pin. Measure out 15¼ inches to the right. There's another pin. Now I know where my center goes, and I know where my corners go. I'm going to partially unroll the quilt top, give myself maybe 18 inches or so of fabric to work with. I'm going to line up the center of my quilt border with the center pin, left corner with the left pin, right corner gets lined up with the right pin, and now I'm going to baste my quilt top into place. Once again, setting my horse. Yes, ma'am.
This is a time you might want to put on that glide foot. It makes it really easy to baste that across.
Absolutely, especially if you're using a fluffier batting that you think is going to get jammed up underneath your your hopping foot, that glide foot is a lifesaver because nothing gets jammed up underneath that.
That's right.
So you pop your glide foot on and you just baste right along. Nothing's going to get in your way. You're not going to have to worry about stitching in creases or getting all wadded up in the backing. So
Kimmy?
stitch. Yes, ma'am.
Do you change your stitch length, or do you leave it at stitch length that you use for quilting? And why, if you do?
I change it simply because I don't need to nail this into place forever. I'm just basting, and I find that it bastes more quickly with fewer stitches per inch. There's no harm in using whatever stitch length you would be using on your quilt top, but I find that anywhere from 4 stitches per inch to 8 stitches per inch will do the job just fine. You want enough stitches so that you're getting a solid quilt line, because you don't want great big stitches that will cause your fabric to kind of bow down. Does that make sense how I'm saying it? So you want enough stitches that it will be held firmly into place, but you don't need like 16 stitches per inch, because then if you blow it while you're basting it into place, that's going to be really a pain in the neck to rip back out and get everything lined up. So I usually go with usually 6 or 8 stitches per inch, just to baste it firmly into place. And when you baste it, you want to baste it just about 1/8 of an inch in from the edge. That way you never have to worry about pulling that basting line out. It's just going to get swallowed up in your binding seam allowance. So you can stitch it and leave it in place. Nobody will ever know that it's there. As before, if you have any fullness, you want to ease from corner to center and center to corner. Don't try and brush it all the way to one corner, because then you're going to have a train wreck when you get down there. You want to keep that fullness in place, deal with it in place, and end up with a nice flat quilt top when you're done. Now, as you work through the quilt, all you have to do is keep that quilt straight. You loaded the quilt onto straight leaders. You have a nice straight on-grain backing that will hold it straight, hold the rest of the quilt straight for you. Your quilt is loaded straight on the top, so all you need to do is make sure that you don't do anything to make it unstraight as you go. I find that especially for beginner quilters, a lot of the problems that you have when you're first getting started with quilting are solved by simply properly loading your quilt. A lot of fullness issues that you have, a lot of problems that you have with seam lines not looking straight, those are all taken care of if you loaded your quilt straight and you kept it straight. It doesn't matter if you're doing computerized work or freehand work, a straight quilt is easier to quilt than a crooked quilt. And for those of you who are using ProStitcher or any kind of computerized system, it's going to be a lot easier for you to line things up, especially in your long borders. It's a whole lot easier to line a border up if the border's straight to begin with. If you've got a crooked, wonky border, you're going to have to be trying to skew things and line things up. But if that border is nice and long and straight, everything is going to fall into place a whole lot more easily and with a lot less frustration on your end. So as you work through the quilt, you move each new section of the quilt into the work area. And before you start doing any stitching at all, you want to just step back and take a look at that new section of quilt. Are your lines straight? If you've got sashing strips, are they laying straight in place? If they're not, you're going to want to just take your hands and just gently manipulate that fabric so that it's laying where you want it to be before you start stitching. Because if it's crooked and you stitch it crooked, it's going to be crooked for a really long time unless you go in there and rip it all out and start all over again, which none of us really want to do. So it doesn't matter if you're going to do an edge-to-edge quilt job or a custom quilt job, make sure it's straight before you start stitching. So with each new advance, you check to make sure that the width is staying what it should be. If it should be 60 inches wide, make sure it stays 60 inches wide. You don't want it to grow or shrink and turn into an hourglass or an oblong. Make sure the edges are where they should be. Make sure the seam lines which connect your blocks to one another, make sure that they look nice and straight. Make sure that your sashing strips are straight. And once everything has been straightened out, and that only takes 10 seconds per advance to fiddle with this stuff. It's not like you're spending an hour standing there manipulating things. Just kind of fuss things into place, and then you can stitch them down and know that everything is going to be straight as it goes. It only takes, yes ma'am.
When you're stitching down everything, do you stitch your sides, both sides, right and left?
Absolutely.
The face of it?
Yep. What I do is I advance each new section into the work area. I grab my measuring tape and I make sure that it is the width that it should be. And then, thanks for asking this question, by the way. That's a great question. Before I start doing any of the stitching in the interior of the quilt, I baste those sides down, left and right, with a line of basting stitches 1/8 inch or 1/8 of an inch in from the edge of the quilt. So once again, those basting lines are swallowed up in my binding seam allowance. By stitching those edges down, I'm making sure that none of the quilting that I'm doing in the interior is going to draw those edges in and give me uneven, non-straight edges. So I baste everything into place, then I clamp my backing, and I do not put the clamps on the machine until I do not put the clamps on the quilt until I've basted those edges into place. Because if you put the clamps on your backing and batting at both ends before you've basted your quilt top into place, you are now applying more tension on the quilt backing than you have on the quilt top. And remember, we just talked a few minutes ago about what will happen if you do that. You'll end up with a not straight quilt. So you baste your edges into place, then you apply your clamps, then you do your quilting. Does that make sense the way I explained it?
Yeah, thank you.
Right. I see that Lori has a question. What do you do when the sashings are not straight and the piecing isn't precise? Do you make it straight and quilt in the slack that straightening all that creates? That's a great question, Lori, and thanks for asking that. Yes, basically the answer to that is yes. Sashing strips that are not straight are going to stick out like a sore thumb on a finished quilt. Most of the time, sashing strips are in a contrasting fabric to our blocks. They're meant to show. So if a sashing strip is crooked, it's going to look really crooked because it's bright red or whatever. It's a color that contrasts with the rest of your blocks. So you have to make sure that those sashing strips are straight before you do any more work. And sometimes, actually most of the time, the reason that those sashing strips aren't straight is because there's fullness in the blocks that moves or migrates out into the sashing strips. So when you straighten up your sashing strips, all of a sudden you're going to notice that, ooh, my block got pretty puffy. But the block is puffy because there's fullness in the block. The sashing strip isn't crooked because there's fullness in the sashing. The sashing strip is crooked because that block is wrong. So you deal with the fullness in the block. You don't let that fullness creep out and wreck your sashing strips. So I would take my hands, I would manipulate those sashing strips, get them nice and straight. If I have to pin baste the block into place in order to keep the sashing strips straight while I stitch them down, I would do so. And I would deal with the block's fullness in the block. And remember, if your block is, let's say, for example, you are quilting a sampler and it's a 12 block sampler and 11 of the blocks turned out great. One of the blocks is not really so great. It's got a lot of fullness and you don't really know what to do with it. Remember, you can cut one square of a fluffier, higher loft batting and just slip it into place under that one rogue block to take up the fullness in that block. My favorite batting for that task is Hobbs Polydown, Polydwn. It's a nice lofty polyester batting. It doesn't get all nasty and stiff and beardy like a lot of polyester battings do. It's very lightweight. It melts into your quilt. You can hardly even tell that it's there when it's all said and done. It just gives you a little bit of loft that will lift up that excess fullness and make it not lay there in great big bunches of excess fullness. It looks like it's full. However, when the quilt is done, you can't see that there's excess batting in there. You can simply see that, oh, that block looks a whole lot better. So, sorry, I kind of got off on a tangent there, but I hope that I answered Lori's question. In the end, everything needs to be nice and straight. Your blocks need to be lined up. Your seam lines that connect the borders to your quilt's interior should be straight. And then you start quilting, because then you know when the quilt comes off the machine, it's going to look just the way that you wanted it to look. And here is that finished quilt. Whoops. This is the quilt that I was showing you how to load. It had some fullness issues, but in the end, I got nice straight sashing strips. I got nice square corners, and I got 4 nice straight sides. Because remember, as long as the outside of the quilt looks nice and straight and square, everything that goes on in the inside of the quilt automatically looks better. So take the time to make sure that your quilt is straight, and you're going to end up with a much nicer finished piece. You'll be really, really much happier with it. I see someone asking, what was the name of that Hobbs batting again? Hobbs Polydown, P-O-L-Y-D-O-W-N. If you buy it, you want to buy it on the roll because it's a little bit loftier on the roll than it is in the package. And if you buy it in a package, you're probably going to have to throw it in the dryer to fluff it up. For some reason, it gets just a little bit more compressed in the package than it does on the roll. I hope that you learned some new tricks today, and I hope that you feel like you got something useful that you can use on your own quilts. Remember that, as I said earlier, if you take just the couple extra minutes that it takes to straighten up your quilt, it really makes the whole rest of the process so much easier for you. When things are straight, it's a lot easier to quilt because you're not tearing your hair out trying to figure out how am I going to deal with this fullness and why is it so crooked and I don't love this. If it's straight, it's easier, it's fun, you're happier with the finished result, and you feel more proud of yourself. And quilting is supposed to be fun. Remember, we're not supposed to be crying. So take the time to make your quilt look nice and tidy, and you'll be a lot happier with the way that it finishes up.
Thank you, Kimmy. We're just sitting here thinking, oh my gosh, we're not even doing things the right way.
Lots of tips.
I think we get lazy sometimes and just throw a quilt on and not do these tips and just to get something off. And so I think as we're more careful, we're more proud of our quilts. So I have a friend that just said, oh, this quilt's not very good, so I'm not going to give it away. And I'm thinking, oh, that's too bad, because she wanted to give it away, but it wasn't square.
Yeah, and sometimes, especially when you're quilting for friends or customers, you can really surprise them with how much better their quilt looks. I mean, you can give them back a quilt that is much more than what they were expecting. They think that they're giving you a train wreck, and you can give them back a beautiful finished quilt. It makes them happier. They're going to piece more quilts because, look, you're a magician. Look what you just did for them.
Did you want to mention anything about floating, a full float on your top?
I prefer not to use that method. Really, the only time that I do a full float is if it's a small quilt that I have pieced and I know darn well it's really, really square and I'm not going to have any fullness to deal with. Because with a full float, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, what are the advantages to not doing a full float?
The advantages of doing a partial float rather than a full float, is that what you mean?
Uh-huh.
Okay. With a full float, the quilt is just hanging there. You don't have that extra set of hands to hold things nice and straight. And the quilt can drift off to one side or the other side without you realizing it. And then when you take the quilt off the machine, you have almost like a parallelogram instead of a nice big square rectangle, which is what you wanted. With a partial float, you've got those extra hands. You can tighten up those rollers. The quilt is going to stay in place. It's not going to accidentally drift one way or the other. And it's going to basically smash that quilt into submission while you nail it into place.
That's right. And I find when I use the Pro Stitcher, it's like a great big embroidery hoop. And you need that equal tension on all 4 sides of your fabric to get the design to go where it should go, right?
Absolutely. And that's a really good point. If you are doing a full float, you've got tension applied to your back. There is no tension applied to your front. So it's very easy to over-tighten the back and end up with a quilt that curls to the back, which you don't want. You want a quilt that lays flat. And with a full float, there's nothing there to help you apply equal tension.
Well, Kimmy, thank you so much for joining us today, and we have plans for Kimmy to join us again later in the year on another topic. So you are such a wealth of information. I just love listening to you and learning from you. Years and years ago when I first started quilting, I was following this person on, I think it was Web Shots, pictures, and this Kimmy Quilts. And finally, when I met the Kimmy Quilts and knew who she was, I'm like, no wonder I love you so much. You are such an amazing quilter. So thank you for joining us today. And next month, our webinar will be on April 14th with another great topic. So join us again. Thanks and goodbye.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day and happy quilting.